Welcome to my talk. It's called 6 Things Every jQuery Developer Should Know. My name is Elijah Manor. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Work for a company called Summit Group. We specialize in providing services for small businesses. You can find me on my blog, elijahmanor.com, and I am on Twitter, like most people. And if you could fill out the evaluation form before you leave, that would be great. Before we get too far in our presentation, you might have met me before but not realize it. About a month ago, I was at the MVP Summit, and I looked much different. This is me now, and with the help of some jQuery love, here was me before. Quite a bit different. Now this right here is a typical Microsoft developer. This might be a Unix or a Ruby. And this is just freaky, this person right here. So anyway, so I can't guarantee that in a month from now you'll recognize me if you see me again. So at least my name is unique, Elijah, unless you start naming your children Elijah just to spite me because I said that. So anyway, let's proceed to our talk. I'm not using PowerPoint because I don't like it. So this is a web-based, which means the slides could actually be a little more interactive. I can actually run the jQuery code on the slide and show you what the language is really doing in small snippets that are digestible. At the end, I have three or four demos prepared, depending on time and what you want to see. And thankfully, I don't have to use the Wi-Fi. They actually have a wired network here, so that should not be an issue. So my name is Elijah again. I've been using jQuery since May 2008-ish, when I started using MVC, the preview edition. It was the reason I started using it is I saw a series of posts by Phil Hack, and I was like, well, that's a good tool to use. I wanted my views to be stupid, but I also wanted to have some rich interactive aspects to it. So I started using jQuery, and then I was thankful that I chose that library because several preview releases later, they actually started shipping jQuery with the project, and then MS Ajax started using it, and then now you heard at the keynote, even more integration. Microsoft's going to actually push some things that have been in MS Ajax for a while now, like templating, data binding, the script manager, and all that stuff, and they're going to try to contribute to jQuery, which is awesome. And still keep it open source. And for those of you who don't know, Microsoft does support jQuery, so if you have a license for Visual Studio or MSDN, you could actually create a help ticket, and they'll help you with your jQuery code. And I've actually talked to some people who know about that, and they said, really, people haven't been using that feature, which I guess is a good thing for the jQuery community. Maybe they're answering the questions first before it propagates to Microsoft, so that's pretty cool. I am one who loves to keep my thumb on the latest technologies, and so, like daily, I scour the web for pertinent information that is important to me, such as web dev, jQuery, MVC, and just .NET related things. And so I do work. Some people wonder, like, do you even work? Or do you just tweet all day? So in the mornings, I schedule them out. And so to prove that, during this talk, a couple of tweets will be scheduled just to prove that it's not me doing it. So I do work, and my boss is sitting in the front row. So he's glad to hear that. So you might recognize my voice. I am one of the co-hosts of the official jQuery podcast with Ralph Whitbeck. And to let you know, based on some feedback, we're going to try to make those shorter and kind of rearrange some content. So at the beginning, you get some takeaways before the interview happens, so that if you can't listen to the whole thing, it's still somewhat helpful. So that's pretty much me. And what we're going to do before we go, there's 6 points. Each point has a series of subpoints. And I designed it such that starting at each point is kind of beginner-level material. I'll talk a little bit more intermediate and then get advanced. And then when the next point comes along, I'll go back down to more beginning, intermediate, advanced. Hopefully, not knowing your experience or your background in jQuery, hopefully if it gets a little too advanced, you could just kind of check out to the next point and then go, oh, well, here's something that's familiar again. If you're bored with intermediate content, just wait to the end of the point. Hopefully there's something you haven't seen before. So we're going to start out with a hard topic to talk about because it's using a pronoun called this. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this right here, not these things. And so since it's using a pronoun, it's kind of awkward to talk about. So when I'm actually talking about this, which is the keyword this, and my hand shaking, when I say this keyword, I'm referring to the context within a function, what that is referring to. So let's get into that. And the reason you need to know this is when you first start using jQuery, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but technically, depending on where you are and what you're doing, it could mean different things. And so that's why it's slightly confusing, especially to beginning people. Under normal circumstances, probably like 90% of the time, this keyword refers to a DOM element. And so let's say we are binding a click event to all the anchor tags that have a demo class. Well, that's a common thing you might do using the event helpers. And so then you pass an anonymous function, and what we're going to do is alert this keyword and its href. Now, the DOM element, the anchor DOM element, has an href property. And so we're showing that here. And so we could click on one of these, and sure enough, I don't know if you could see it, but it's showing the href of the anchor, which is actually the DOM element. It's not the jQuery object. And just to show you what the HTML we were actually looking at on the slide is just 2 anchor tags, and here's the href that we just worked on. Now there are 2 exceptions of when this keyword does not refer to the DOM element. The first one, which has been around for quite a while, is if you write a jQuery plugin. Most beginners aren't probably writing jQuery plugins, but the more intermediate and advanced you get, you'll want to abstract your code out so that you can unit test it, and it's just a lot better to program that way. And so this is a general layout of what a jQuery plugin looks like. It might be familiar to you, might not. We won't talk about all the nuances of it, but basically we are, the $sign is a shortcut for jQuery. FN is a shortcut for prototype. And so we're adding a prototype to jQuery called myPlugin, that's how you're going to call it. And then right when you get in the plugin, this statement refers to the jQuery object that was a result of the selector. So for example, the way we're going to call our plugin is we're going to grab all the anchor tags that have a demo class, and we're going to call our plugin. As soon as it gets in here, this keyword right here is referring to the jQuery object, not the DOM element as we noticed before. And so the jQuery object, which is a wrapper around a set of DOM elements, essentially, has a length. And then a common technique is to iterate over the DOM elements that are in that wrapper. And so what you'll see is people using each, which is a method off jQuery, and we'll loop over these 2 anchor tags. And then we'll do this ID. And at this point, once we're inside this method, the same rule applies, the 90% rule. That is a DOM element. And so it has an ID property. So we're going to run this plugin against this code, which uses these 2 elements. And just to prove again, the HTML that Google and Microsoft is just an unordered list with 2 anchor tags. And so running it, we should see that it's selecting 2 anchor tags, and it will alert this link is 2. And then once it loops through, it should say the ID of each of these, which if we looked, the ID of this one is Google link, and the ID of this one is Microsoft link. So by running it, we do get a length of 2, and then it loops through saying the IDs. So the first one is Google link, and the second one is Microsoft link. So that's not extremely interesting. Maybe you didn't know that, maybe you did. But what's even more interesting is the second exception. And let me get it right. In jQuery 1.4, which was released in January, the 14 days of jQuery, if you followed that, there's a new method called proxy. And what proxy lets you do is basically lets you define what you want this keyword to represent. And so something you might do is, let's say we have a Twitter object literal. And so we're defining an object. It kind of looks like JSON, if you're familiar with JSON, but it's not a string, it's actually code. So we're defining an object with the username of Elijah Manor, which is my Twitter handle. And then we're going to have a tweet method, which all it does is will alert hello and say hello Elijah Manor, basically is what it's doing. Now, right now, I could just type in twitter.tweet, open paren, close paren, and it would say hello Elijah Manor, just like you might expect. However, if you were to, let's see, each of these refers to a button. So this line of code refers to the first button. This line of code is the second button, and the third button. So the first one, we're going to just try to do something that maybe you would think would work. So we're going to apply a click event to the first button, and we're going to say, hey, I want you to really run the twitter.tweet method. Sounds reasonable. And if you didn't know any better, you might think it would say hello Elijah Manor. But it doesn't. jQuery actually changes this keyword when you're using its event handlers and things, because really most of the time you probably want it to reference the DOM element that was actually clicked. But this is not the case. We actually want it to reference this object literal. So if we were to actually run update 1, whoa, it doesn't work. It says hello undefined. Now you might be like, well, why is it undefined? Well, if you start to look at this code, when this event handler gets fired, this keyword will actually refer to what was selected, which was actually the button. So the button doesn't have a username property. The button's, it's a DOM element. It doesn't know what username is. And so you'll get undefined. So the way to use this new property, or the new method proxy, is you essentially call it the same way. You start with your selection. You say, I want to provide a click event. And then you say, okay, I want to use proxy because I want to control what this keyword will be when the event handler is fired. And so there's two properties, or two arguments to the proxy method. The first one is what method do you want to call? And so I'm saying, okay, well, I really want to call Twitter tweet. And the second property is the context. And that defines what this statement will resolve to, basically, once you get inside your method. So the update 2 will actually print Elijah Manor, just like we expected. There's actually an alternate, there's an override version of proxy. They both work the same way, but you just call them differently. And essentially, the first parameter is the context. So you give the context first. Okay, when I want this to refer to, this keyword to refer to Twitter. And the second parameter is the name of the method that you want it to call off of the context. And so we would actually say, in quotes, tweet. And that works the same way as the first one. And so it will respond appropriately. Hello, Elijah Manor. And just to show you, the buttons were nothing special down here. It's just a list item with a whole bunch of buttons in it. So now that you hopefully understand a little bit more about this keyword, the exceptions of when it might not be a DOM element, because most of the times it is the DOM element, it still does confuse some developers, especially when they're new. And the confusion comes in when they save off this keyword, the value of that, into a variable. And so let's say you wrapped the DOM element in a jQuery object, and then you stored it to some variable. Well, the confusion comes in later when that developer uses jQuery wrapped element or whatever that variable is. They might forget, was this really a DOM element or a jQuery object? And the more and more you use it, that's less of a problem, but especially for beginners and for me as well, I know that was an issue. To alleviate the confusion, what some developers do, which I don't do anymore, they prepend a $sign to the beginning of the variable. Now, it doesn't mean anything special to the language, but it indicates something to the developer that, okay, this is a jQuery object. Unfortunately, that's really Hungarian notation, and if you've done, 132 development back in the day, that was the big rave. But as you know, it could actually be dangerous because, maybe somewhere along the line you redefine the value of that variable to a DOM element, and then the variable doesn't mean anything anymore. And actually, I've seen, by reviewing lots of people's books and code source, I've noticed people using it incorrectly. They're not consistent with their naming. Like sometimes it really isn't referring to DOM elements or a jQuery object, and it's just a mess. So if it works for you, especially learning, go for it, but I don't. I think it's kind of bad practice, really, but it's really up to you. So we've already kind of shown this, but if you have a DOM element, how do you make it into a jQuery object? Because then you have all these great methods that you could call off it. It's really easy. You just say $sign and you put the DOM element inside of it, and now boom, it's a jQuery object. And you could call all the cool stuff like fade out and animate and all the things that you really wanted. And that's really not the part that people need help with. I think most people understand that. Not as many people know how to reverse the process. I do have a jQuery object, but I want to actually get to the nitty-gritty of the DOM element. And so let's say we selected all anchor tags on our page. We easily just say .get, open paren, close paren, and that will return the JavaScript array, the real array of DOM elements. And then you can maybe do sort or, whatever things you might do, joining and stuff like that. If you want to get a particular element, like just the first element or the middle, there's really 3 ways to call it that are all kind of quite different. The first one's a little hokey, but the last 2 are more appropriate. But you can actually say get, open paren, close paren, which returns all the elements in an array. And then you can just use the array syntax and give me the 0th item, which is the first one. Or for those of you who like method type calls, there's a get, and you just pass it the index. If you pass 0, that's the first one. And if you, even more terse, want to use the array syntax, you don't have to use any of these. jQuery knows that, hey, you really probably meant to get that particular DOM element. So that's pretty much about this keyword. So hopefully I won't have to say this keyword all the time again. The next part, and we're going to brush over the first slides pretty quick because I think most of you know selectors. But my point in selectors is I think a lot of developers, when they're developing web technologies, they might not be using the full extent of CSS. Like many of you might not be using CSS3 stuff because it's not fully supported across all browsers, et cetera, and you're just trying to support old stuff. And so you might not be as familiar with that syntax and how to really grab elements that you really want. Like you might be doing it a slightly, unbeneficial way or something like that. So my point is jQuery supports all of these wonderful, XPath type expressions, CSS3, and it works on all browsers, even old ones. And so I encourage you to learn some of those that you might not be familiar with because it can help you in your jQuery code, which will make it faster because you're not doing all these weird things to find the stuff that you want. So most of you are familiar with very simple things that are supported almost everywhere with CSS, like give me all the anchors, or give me the anchor that's in a div, or give me all the TRs that have a class of odd, which there are other ways to do that, but this is just a trivial example. There are some lesser-known selectors. Well, I say lesser-known, but you might not be using these as much if you're just doing straight CSS, like when you're doing web development. One is the give me all anchor tags that end with MP3, so that could easily just pick out all the anchors that are MP3 files. So you might want to, maybe prepend a special icon that looks like it's a music file, or you could, easily use grab all the anchor tags that are going to launch a new tab or a new browser window by saying target equals blank. And there's several others, and all of those aren't very interesting. But if the reason you don't know these things is just because you don't think you could use them in your normal language, then I encourage you to look further. Now, there's some things jQuery supports that aren't in any spec, CSS3 spec or XPath. They provide some some filters, selector filters, and in these you just have to know, because nowhere else would you pick these up. You could actually do a : input, and you might think at first, well, what's so special about that? I could just say quote input quote, and that should get me most items. But really, it won't give you a drop down, because a drop down is really a select statement, or select statement. So our text area, I mean. So if we did a : input, it'll give you all things that are actually input, like you put data in, like if it's select or input or a text area. And then there's a disabled one, which will select all things on your page that are disabled. Maybe you want to quickly enable those things. And then there are more advanced ones, like there's one called : contains. And so that'll take all the list items on your page and say, okay, now I want to pare those down and filter by those that contain the string Abby. And I know this syntax is a little screwed up. The formatter I'm using didn't like that. But essentially what that would do is it would look at all the LIs on my page, and it would find, oh, here's the one with Abby. And it would return me this particular element. Now, most of that stuff wasn't very interesting. And so now we're going to get something a little more intermediate. And then there's something slightly more advanced, which has been around for a while, but when I talk to people, they don't seem to know about it. When you do a jQuery selector, you could also, there's a second parameter, which it doesn't seem many people know about, and it's the context. So it tells jQuery, okay, in my large DOM, let's say here's the content of our page. We want to tell jQuery, well, don't start at the document and then search for things below. I really want you to start here, because I know this is my starting point. I know things above that I don't really care about. And so to increase performance, I want you to actually start at this particular div and then search for things underneath it. And essentially, this syntax right here, the second parameter is where I want it to start. So I want it to start at my div, that's the ID my div, which we saw here. This div has my ID. And then from that point, we want to search for anchors that have a my class that are underneath the span. Now that seems pretty cool, and hopefully, I don't want you to start using that immediately, because there is a caveat where you could actually write bad code that actually performs worse than if you had written something else. If your context is overly complicated, like if it's not an ID, then it could really screw up jQuery and how it does things. The optimal way is to start with one location and then search underneath. Because what this is doing is jQuery has to start at the top of the document, look for all the forms, and then find the ones that have a start here underneath that. And then from that point, once it's done with that, it took them forever, not really, but then it uses that as a starting point for the second part. I really don't encourage you to use either of these, even though it's good to know that concept, because there's another syntax that will do the exact same thing. And it actually reads easier. It's using the find, oops, I clicked it. It actually went to the API for that, using the find method. So this way it reads left to right, which most people used to Fluent interfaces, they kind of read left to right when they're doing chaining. So this point we're going to start with a particular ID, and that indicates, okay, here's the starting point. And then you do the find and pass another selector, which is really the exact same thing. Under the covers, same performance. And then you perform some action. So I encourage you to use the third syntax to know about it and to realize, hey, I could speed up things by using this. The thing I've talked about recently with some people is the ability to create custom selector filters. And really, there's not a lot of material I've seen on the web talking about this, but whereas we saw briefly there was like : input colon disabled, and then we showed colon contains, you can actually create your own. So in this case, and this is kind of a really weird example, but I'm just showing what you could do, is I created a selector filter called element name starts with. And then you could pass an argument to it. And so in this case, I'm using the asterisk, which means select everything, which is very not fast, but I'm just trying to prove a point here. And so grab everything on the page, and then I want you to pare that down and filter it using this special new selector filter. And I said, okay, and give me everything, all the elements that start with a D. And so if we actually look at what's on this page is we got an unordered list with a list item. We got a div, a dictionary list, dictionary term, dictionary definition, yada, yada, yada. And so what we should see, and I'm looping over these, returning the node name, which DOM elements have a node name, which basically it tells you, I'm a div, etc. And so if we run this, it should say it found a div, which is the top level. Oh, I found a DL, I found a DT, a DD, DT, DD. I know that probably won't mean much to your code now, but it shows you the flexibility. And so, yeah, it has a lot of these weird-looking parameters to it. So when you create a new selector filter, there's the element that you're actually working with. There's an index based on where it is within the selection, which we're not using. There's metadata, and there's actually quite a bit of stuff in there, but we were only concerned with the parameter they passed, which happens to be the fourth item in that array. And then there's the stack, which kind of shows you kind of where it came from. And what we're doing here is creating a regular expression. We're prepending the caret, which if you're familiar with regular expressions, says this is at the beginning of a string. We pass in what they said, and we made it ignore the case, because I didn't want to have to say a capital D here or whatever. So it's just, if it starts with like uppercase D or lowercase d, just find it. And then you return true if you want to include it in the selection, and you return false if you want to exclude it. And so I'm basically returning true to everything that starts with a D. Another thing that you should know, and this is really not really jQuery specific, this is just really programming good practices, is when you use selectors, this is a really bad way to write your code, where you have this selection, you perform an action, you do the selection again, perform an action, and again. Now, this is obvious to you, but once you start writing a complex application, it might be harder to spot these, but it's good practice, to save off your selection, which is the jQuery object, and then perform your actions that way. So it's cached, basically. So you only get the hit one time. In this case, these are, get document by ID, so it's really not slow. But imagine this is a complicated selector. It could really be bad. Another approach, which is actually kind of nice, is instead of doing either of those, like the bad way or the other way, is to do chaining. And most of you probably know what chaining is, but it's another way that you can reuse your selector that's cached. And it's very fluent. It's like, okay, I got the element, I'm going to hide it, and then I'm going to change the HTML, and then I'm going to fade it in. It's just boom, 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 very logical, left to right. And you could do that because most, like 90% of the jQuery methods return the jQuery object, which allows this chaining to be possible. And you'll see that in jQuery plugins. They'll eventually return the jQuery object, etc. Okay, so that was pretty much selectors. Here's some more information you might want to look into, some useful tools for the selectors. The Firebug add-on, if you don't have it, where have you been? Because it's awesome. There's something many people don't know is there's a FireQuery plugin for the Firebug add-on. It's kind of confusing, but what it will actually do, we'll show a little bit later. It adds additional information to the HTML tab in Firebug, and you can actually visualize where the event handlers are attached. Like it'll actually show, and you can actually see data that was appended to those DOM elements. And that way, it makes it a little bit easier to debug. There's the jQuery bookmarklet, which is actually a feature that the FireQuery plugin that enables you to, if you just want to play around with the web page and it doesn't have jQuery, but you want to play around with the DOM to see what things you could do, you click this bookmarklet, it will inject jQuery onto that page, enabling you to hack around. There is a jQuery selector playground that was written by Carl Swedberg and Cody Lindley, both of which jQuery team members. And this is a really slick website. It basically has a bunch of HTML here, and here's a bunch of sample selectors, getting from simple, like we showed before, slightly complex, and to ones that, wow, that's pretty cool. Like here's one showing the contains, and it'll actually, all of these contain the string second level. You could toggle it and, oops, where was I? Untoggle it. Show me all visible items, just lots of things that you might not have seen, kind of in one happy place. And then if you want to write your own selector against the HTML, it's right here as well. Oops. There's the selector gadget bookmarklet, which is pretty cool. And actually, this kind of dovetails into my second point. Dave Ward, which is sitting in the second row up here, did a screencast of how I used Firebug to learn jQuery. And in it, he obviously shows Firebug a lot and how you could play around with the DOM of the page that you're on. But he also shows this selector gadget bookmarklet. And I want to quickly show how this might be used. Oh man, I'm not signed in. What we're going to do is I tweet a lot, but I tweet from a lot of different clients. TweetDeck, yada, yada. So what we're going to do is use selector gadget to help define a selector that we could use to pinpoint which Twitter client I'm using so that we could write a little bit of code to dedupe those and figure out what I've been using recently. And so first we're going to look for, okay, here's one, Hootsuite. So I used Hootsuite. So the selector gadget, which loaded down here, will say, okay, well, did you mean you wanted the anchor tag? And I'm like, whoa, no, that's like everything. So it highlights, green is what I said I wanted, and yellow is what it thinks I might want. And so, well, I'm like, no, I don't want anchor tags that are in my tweet. And so then it says, so then it thinks, oh, I only want the anchor tags within this particular tweet. And I'm like, no, I really don't want those anchor tags. And so it goes, oh, well, maybe you just want the anchor tags that are at this particular level. And you're like, no, I don't care when I tweet about it. I really want to know what client I used. And so this way, it almost got what we wanted. But then my mobile application actually tweets where I was using geopositioning. So it says I used Tweety from the strip. I'm like, I don't care where I was. I really want to know. And then it said, oh, well, everything's gone. And I'm like, no, this is what I wanted. So after some crazy suggesting, it's smart enough to kind of figure out what you really intended by saying, I really want this and I don't want that. Eventually, we got a selector, which is what we wanted. So let's open up and quickly paste in. And let me try to zoom in here. So here's the selector, which is what the selector gadget spit out. And then it gave me all these items. But you notice, well, let's do something a little bit nicer. Oh, where'd that go? We're going to loop over them, do a for each, and then we're going to keep doing. We're going to log out the So that's the DOM element, so we're going to wrap it so that we can get the text easily. And we're going to run that again. And before we do that, let's, in Firebug, you can say clear, which actually clear the console. And so now if we look to the left, that's sort of helpful, but I would really like to dedupe that because that's pretty crazy. Oh, man, it keeps removing that. That stinks. Well, actually, due to time, I might actually skip the deduping process. But I was going to create an array, and then jQuery has a $.inArray method, and you pass it the array and the item that you're looking for, and it'll return basically true or false if it's there, and if it's not, I will append it, push it to the array, and then I was going to show it to do that. But due to time, there's some other demos that are actually more interesting. But that's, watch Dave Ward's video if you want to actually see more about that. So to our next point. So we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of events. And before we get too far, it's important to understand what event bubbling is. Event bubbling is, let's look at this example real quick. So here's the HTML that we're going to look at to show what event bubbling is. This might be a review, but we'll get to more interesting things. If I clicked on this TD, where it says jQuery, if nothing listens to that, or if something does listen to it and performs some event handler, it will continue to bubble up the chain. So maybe something's listening to the TR. It could perform some action. When it's done, it could bubble up to the table. If it has an event handler for the table, it'll respond to that. So it's kind of, and then once it gets to the document, it kind of just goes away. So that's the concept of event bubbling. And to kind of demonstrate that, we're going to add a click event to the table, the most outer layer. And we're going to have an anonymous function and say you clicked the e.target. So e is the jQuery event. There's a target, which means what element started that chain of bubbling. And then we're going to say the node name, which basically says, this was a div or a TD or what have you. And so what we're going to do is first click in the TD, and it's going to say, well, obviously you clicked the TD. So that bubbled all the way up to the table, and it said you clicked the TD. We're going to click on the TR, which the best way to do that is to click between the TDs. I clicked on the TR, nothing was listening to it, so it bubbled up eventually to the table, and it said you clicked the TR. And then we could click on the table as well, and obviously that works because that's where we put the event handler. So those are important concepts because the next point is you could actually change that behavior slightly. So if we are, first let's look at our HTML so you know what's going on. We have an unordered list with one list item. It's an anchor tag, which goes to my Twitter account, and the contents is my Twitter handle. So what we're doing is at the topmost level, the unordered list, we are saying, alert, you click the unordered list. But also we have another event on the actual anchor tag that's beneath it. And it says, basically, you clicked the anchor. But what I'm doing after that is I'm saying, prevent the default behavior for this particular action that you just made. And so what you'll see is when I click Elijah Manor, it will say that I clicked the anchor. But it didn't go to my Twitter page because that was the action that should have done. And so I'm preventing the default behavior. But then when that's done, it allows it to propagate up to the UL. And that's, if you saw, it did two alerts, one for the anchor tag and then one for the UL. So that's fine and dandy. And I actually thought for a long time that prevent default was the same as return false. And that's not correct. Because I thought, well, eDefault seems a little more readable to people. And so I started using that more and more. But then when I realized there's actually a difference. Return false. So we have the same scenario, same markup. We're providing click events for the same items, the anchor and the unordered list. But what we're doing in this case, instead of propagate prevent default, we're saying return false. And so what this does, behind the scenes, returns false is implicitly doing a prevent default, which we saw before, but also a stop propagation, which means it's not going to go up the chain anymore. It's just going to die. And so that sometimes is useful if maybe you're integrating with a third-party plugin and you know they're looking for certain elements, but you want to do something too, and you don't want them to respond to that. So what we'll see when we click Elijah Manor, not only will it not go to my Twitter page, but it won't go up to the UL. So we should only see one alert box this time, which is, so here's the one we expected, and here's the one that kind of died away. So it's never going up to the UL where we actually provided an event handler. Most people know about event helpers. Click, double click, mouse over. We've used them several times in this demo already. The part where, actually, there's several reasons why not to use them, but one reason is if someone clicks or double clicks really quick on something, I really want to do the same thing, and I don't want, if you use the event helpers, you actually have to provide it twice. You say, okay, for paragraphs to have a click me class on click, I want you to say hover, which doesn't make sense, but provide this event handler, and then also for the double click, do the same thing. And so it's kind of redundant. And really, when you learn more about event helpers, it's just a convenient wrapper around the bind method. And so you might as well be using the bind because you can do a lot more cool things with it. So we could say bind here off the same thing, and using a space delimited string, we could say provide this event handler for both of these events at the same time. So it's a little more terse. And not only can you bind things, you could remove the binding as well. And there's 3 ways to do that. If you want to remove this event handler, you could say unbind to the same selector, open paren, close paren. Don't do this. This is really bad, but you can do it. And the reason it's bad is because other people could be adding events to that selection as well, and you're blowing those away as well. A slightly safer way to unbind your events is to pass which events that you want the event handlers to be removed. So in this case, I say unbind everything for click and double click. That seems like a good idea, but that could also be dangerous because someone else might have added an event handler for those 2 events, and you're blowing those away as well. The safest way, if you ever want to unbind your stuff to clean up after yourself, is to unbind, telling it which events and which event handler. That's the safe way to do it. Now, that sounds great, using bind over event helpers. But you could get into a bind. You could it could be problematic. If you look on a lot of forums, you'll see, hey, my click handler's not firing. What's the deal? Well, the problem here is, first let's look at the HTML we're dealing with. We got an ordered list with class demo, and we have one LI called static item. We're binding a click event to that item that will basically append a smiley face afterwards. And then right after, we're appending a dynamic item to the unordered list, this one. So this one works as expected. Yay, smiley, smiley. But this one doesn't work. Click, 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 click. Because what it's doing behind the scenes, it's only, when you say bind, it's only going to bind those events to things that currently exist in your DOM. Once you start adding things dynamically from results of JSON and appending things, nothing's going to work. You have to bind again if you want to do that. So that seems really bad, so the next concept came out of using the live method instead. All this is the exact same code, but instead of saying bind here, I just say live here, and everything magically works. And the reason it does that, it's using event delegation. And so this is kind of similar to the bubbling concept we talk about. When I say I want for all LIs under the UL, when they click it, I want to run this event handler. If it doesn't find anything, well, that's not a good case. When I click on dynamic item, it doesn't find anything. So then the event will bubble up, and bubble up, go all the way, and the event will bubble all the way up to the document, the very tippy top. And jQuery, when you say live, it registers all that information on the document level. And so the event goes all the way to the top, hits the document at the very top, and then jQuery says, oh, did anyone use a selector UL demo LI and click it? Because if they did, I want you to run the click me. And so this kind of defers all that logic once the person actually clicks, instead of appending things at runtime. And so that way, this one keeps working. jQuery 1.4.2, which just came out, provides yet another way to do all this. And the reason they did it is because, well, several reasons, but the live method, the event had to bubble all the way up the tree to the document. And depending on the depth of your document, that could be poor performance. And so delegate actually lets you choose a point in your DOM. Oh, well, I didn't. It lets you choose a point. Yeah, I guess it did. Choose your point and say, I want you to start here. And so anything under this point, I want you to listen to. I don't want you to go all the way up to the document. I want you to stop at a certain point and just forget about everything else that's in the chain above you. And so what we're going to do here, same event handler, we're going to say for this select. So we changed our selector a little bit because in the previous page, well, the syntax is different. Actually, no, the selector is different. In the previous one, I was doing live on the actual list item. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying I'm defining the starting point. And I say, okay, for the unordered list, I want you to delegate everything below it. I want you to listen basically to LIs that are clicked, and then do click me. And so what that essentially does is we'll do LI, and then really I attach nothing to that, but then the event will bubble up to the UL, and this is where the information is stored. Whereas before it was stored at the very top of the document, now we're storing it at a particular instance, in this case the UL. And so the code will work just like live does, but we have a lot more control over how far up the chain it's going. Another problem with the live events is you couldn't append it to a really long chain of events. Let's say you did a selection, then you did fade out, and then you did append to, and then do .live. That doesn't work, unfortunately. And you think it would work because everything else works that way. But with this new delegate method, you could do those complicated chaining events, and it will work just fine. We might quickly go over these because I want to show some demos. There are bad ways to store data on your elements. One is to use the attributes like the alt tag or the title tag. Don't do that if you want to add special information onto your DOM element. That's just bad practice, and there are much better ways to do that using the data method in jQuery. You could actually do very simple. So for this particular list item that's right here, I'm going to add a key value pair, basically. So I'm going to add a special info key and put some information on top of it. And then I'm going to retrieve that just by saying data again and giving it the key. So all this does, real quickly, is retrieves me that special information that I attach to that DOM element. And not only can you do simple things, but you could attach complicated objects to elements. So the same object right here, I'm attaching an object literal, first name Elijah, last name Manor. And you retrieve it in a similar fashion using the data and a key. And actually, off the key, I could just say first name, which will give me the first name of this object literal, which will say Elijah, because that's what I stuck on that element. And quickly, I want to show if we look here, using the Fire Query plugin, this is the list item I was adding data to. It's actually showing, here's the key that I added, and here's the actual data I added to that element. So you can visually see what's being done behind the scenes. And actually, you could also see the click events that are attached to other things. So this is my H1 on this page. If I click the title, it goes to the next slide. Well, you can see that has a click event, and here's the function that does the click event. So just kind of a useful tool. There's another way thing. I'm not going to run this demo, but I'm going to show you. There's another way to actually attach data. Instead of giving it a key, you don't have to give it a key. You can just directly give it an object, literal. And that's actually much more performant. It's faster instead of doing the key-based. You can actually combine the two methods, and they won't override each other. You could do the key approach, and you could do just directly adding the data, and they'll both work fine. I won't show you that because I want to get to the demos. We're going to skip over the metadata plugin. The last point is to combine and minify your scripts. Hopefully you know this. There are a lot of great tools out there. The Microsoft Ajax minifier just came out recently with a new edition that minifies your CSS and your scripts. Previously, it only did scripts. The YUI compressor is really good. It will also combine all the scripts into one script as well. That's a nice feature it does. There's a .NET open source library that has an MS build task for that, as well as Ajax minifier has the MS build task as well. Google Closure Compiler is probably the best at reducing size. And actually, the jQuery team is using that now instead of the YUI compressor. They've actually seen a lot of performance gain reducing size. And there's two great Firebug tools that will help you understand your page performance. One's YSlow. It's a Firebug plugin. And Google has a page speed plugin as well. And the cool thing about page speed is it will actually not only recommend changes, but in some cases, it'll actually do it for you. Like images, it'll say, this is not compressed. By the way, here's the compressed version. Your script's not compressed. By the way, here's a link to your compressed version. I know I'm going quick, but I want to show the demos. Okay, so there's three. I'll do quickly. Everyone's been doing a little Twitter client. So this one uses a page flip plugin, which will flip over and then give me my latest tweet, which happens to be, I told you that I pre-scheduled my tweets. I'm giving a jQuery presentation, and I think I did that about 15 minutes ago through a scheduled tweet. That's using a jQuery plugin, and but the most interesting thing I want to show is this one. 5 minutes. And we'll actually look into the code of this one. Let's see. So this will actually go out, hopefully, if everything's connected. There we go. Nope. Wow, that's not good. Crap. This one is actually interfacing with the Picasa API, which doesn't seem to work. Okay, we could show this one. This one is using, and that one actually wasn't Twitter, but this is actually going out and grabbing the latest 200 tweets using JSON-P, and it visualized the timeline of all my tweets. And so if I look at, during the keynote, I was saying, I could return OData as JSON and get the data from SharePoint. That's pretty cool. And this is the one I tweeted about 15 minutes ago. So let's look into that code real quick. Unfortunately, that Picasa one didn't work. Which one is it? Timeline. I think I'll make my font bigger. Get pretty big. So here we're defining a Twitter API, and we're basically giving my timeline, which is Elijah Manor, and then you tell it I want it in the JSON format, and you give it a count. So how many tweets do you want to pull back? I say 200, and then you have to append the callback equals question mark. That will indicate that since this is a cross-domain request, that will allow it to actually do that without griping. And so we're going to use jQuery.getJSON, pass in the URL, and it's going to pass all the data back in this anonymous function. We're going to loop over that data that it came back because it's JSON information, so it's just array of objects. And then I had to kind of look up all the information from Twitter, and this plugin is really quite interesting. But it's the timeline. It's called the Simile plugin, so it's actually pretty cool. And before I actually tell it what information to put in the timeline, I actually replace all the URLs with HTML links because it's just text that comes back. And so if I say a URL, I want to convert that into an anchor tag. And then basically you just create your timeline. You have to do some strange trickery for the plugin to know what you're talking about. But when it comes down to it, all you have to do is you grab the element that you want, and then on the click, you just go out and get call the function that goes to get the JSON data and populates the timeline. I guess I won't go into two more. I'll leave questions because I don't have 2 minutes. Does anyone have questions? Sorry, I kind of brushed through the end real quickly. Hey.
Do you have a recommended approach for passing data into jQuery data used from the server side?
Well, like, are you calling some request to get the data first?
No. So, like when I'm writing out the page,
Yeah.
I want to store additional information about the content that's going on the page.
Yeah.
Like a list item or something. Should I just write out the JavaScript to insert that into the jQuery data object?
Are we using web forms or? Yeah. Well, you could do you could register, on the page, you could register the scripts and stuff like that, and you could write a small snippet of jQuery if you knew the selector, and then the data at that point, and so you could write that in a JSON type form, like an object literal or something, and shove that in there. So when the page loads, it'll register at the bottom probably. That'll get ran and apply the information. I haven't done that per se, but that's a way to do that. Most of the time when I'm grabbing data, it's like I go get it first from maybe a web service, or I'll have a page, an MVC, that if I go to it, it'll return a JSON result or something like that, and then I'll attach it at that point. But yeah, you could probably do that. If you want to talk more about it, you can come up after. Any other questions? Actually, anyone who's asking a question, Dave Ward did a series on jQuery on TechPub, which is a website Rob Connery and James Avery put together. Really high quality screencasts. They're paid, like you have to pay for them, but they're pretty cheap. But he has like several free passes for the jQuery series. He's done a great job showing jQuery and jQuery UI. So if you have a question, come to me and we'll make sure you get a ticket until they run out. So next question. Go ahead. From what I heard, most people haven't had a lot of issues actually upgrading. The biggest problem people have upgrading is jQuery 1.4 and above is much more particular about JSON if you're retrieving JSON from a source. Whereas before it was kind of loosey-goosey, and so it would just kind of let something in and maybe it would break. now they're real rigid. And really these days when you're dealing with JSON, there's plugins and open source tools that will emit proper JSON. So if you're not doing that, if you're kind of wiring together your JSON on the fly with strings and stuff, which I don't recommend, you might have a problem. But if you do upgrade and have that problem, there is a plugin that they wrote. You can find probably on jQuery14.com because they had a whole 14 days of jQuery that they did. And there should be a link to that plugin which will revert the way it does JSON. So if you have a problem with that feature, there's a plugin for that, which that will revert that one piece. You'll have all the other great things of 1.4. And I recommend you go to 1.4.3 because there shouldn't be any breaking changes there as well. But the only one you might run into is the JSON piece breaking if it's malformed. Any other questions? This is all part of the Simile jQuery plugin. Like all I had to do is provide the data to it. And I told it when the tweet was because I know the date from the feed. And then there's actually this little bar down here. You see the little, I can move this around. And obviously you can see a tweet a lot. I guess these open gaps are like the weekends or something, but what? Oh. Yeah, at night when I'm sleeping. I don't schedule tweets while I sleep, so. But yeah, it's a really great plugin, and it's one of the few that it's compelling to actually visually show some information. And actually, a lot, if you like the Ajax Control Toolkit, I don't know if anyone's used that before by Microsoft. Previously, not too long ago, they have wrapped those in jQuery plugins as well. So if you like the Sea-Dragon plugin, which is sort of like Deep Zoom for Silverlight, you could use that as a jQuery plugin. There's some nice ones the toolkit has that aren't really in the jQuery community. There's one I like that's instead of using a captcha or or something to prevent spamming, there's one on the Ajax Control Toolkit. I think it's anti-bot or something like that. Yeah, no bot. And it basically just has some trickery. Like it tries to figure out if a computer's interacting with it, and it'll do slight timeouts. And if you're clicking a whole bunch of times, or if you're responding too quickly to action, like it's not humanly possible to click in 0.5 milliseconds. And so it's doing these tiny little things that will probably get rid of a lot of your spam traffic, and I think that's pretty cool. But those are all wrapped in jQuery plugins, and obviously from the keynote, there's a lot more interaction going to be happening. Recently, jQuery hasn't had a script manager-ish thing, so sometimes relationships between plugins, the dependency is kind of hard to know what order to put them in. So those are some of the cool things, and the templating obviously is really cool. But any other questions? My presentation is also on my blog. I will blog about it, and since it's all on the web, you could click through it. All the links are hot, so I'll post that pretty soon. And it should be available on the MIX site as well. So please fill out the evaluation forms. I appreciate it. Thank you.